Hey everyone, this is Grandmaster Josh Friedel. Today I wanted to present a topic which is actually a very difficult one to cover because there are many aspects to it, and it's not necessarily a one decision thing where I can show you certain crucial moments in a game and then kind of say, this is how this position works. I would say that it's sort of a series of positions, and it's like a position that you have to go slowly. So I'm actually going to show just one game. This is between Magnus Carlsen and Alireza Firoujza. It's been played at Norway Chess. And this was a position they got where Carlsen is white against Firoujza. He is 3 versus 2 in a rook endgame. It should very much be drawn. And but it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. And even Firoujza failed to draw, and I'll show you how that happened. But mostly I want to talk about the proper attitudes to have when you're trying to play something like this, because I definitely encourage you to try to win this, especially at amateur level. These things get blown all the time, and as you can see, even very strong grandmasters like Firoujza can lose positions like this now and again. And I want to talk about the different ways to play the offense as well as ways to play the defense, because I think both are really important. And these things add up when you start to get stronger, especially you end up getting these really long endgames. The ability to, milk the most out of these positions when you're up the pawn and then hold it every single time, draw every single time. When you're down the pawn, those points really add up eventually. And it's one of the things that eventually, that can make you that much, give you that extra half point when you need it in a tournament or whatever it is. So these kind of endgames, and it doesn't have to be 3 versus 2 rook endgame. It could be any kind of endgame, like, like rook and bishop against rook is a very common example. There, knowledge comes into play, like, a lot. But any kind of endgame which should be drawn but needs to be played precisely, how to play that, and how to, defend or attack. So one of the things to remember is that, and this is important to just, know your basic endgames, knowing the proper result of a position, because it changes drastically. If white is winning here, your approach should be entirely different than if it's drawing. And what I mean by that is, if you have a winning position here, you should simply find your winning plan, or if you know it, that's great, or find a winning plan, figure out the best way, be careful to prevent counterplay, and execute your winning plan. If your opponent tries to prevent that plan, you should have some other way to get them, right? Some other plan that will work. Or it'll fail tactically or something. If you're winning, you should simply execute your plan. You should not do anything fancy. You should not allow counterplay. When you're trying to win a drawn position, however, it completely changes how you should play. Because if the game goes according to plan, you should draw. And the most important thing to remember is that the way you will win is because you need your opponent to either make a ton of small mistakes, and usually that's not enough, or you need them to blunder. So how do you get them to do that? Number one, you have to view this kind of thing as a bit of an endurance test. Trying to win a drawn endgame is not just about the moves. The fact is, an endgame usually occurs at the end of the game. Uh, don't have to be a genius to figure that one out, but I thought I'd point it out. And what that means is that people get tired. Imagine it's like the second game or third game in a day or something. People get tired, and that's something you need to use. So part of it is to make sure that you're aware that you need your opponent to be tired. So I would argue that the mistake that was made by Alireza at the end of this game would never have been made if he were not tired. So I think that's something. Even someone young and strong as he is can get tired. That means almost all your opponents can also get tired. So you need to extend the game is a big thing when you're white. You want to be able to extend the game, meaning that you don't just simply you don't just push your pawns. Oh, well, they traded off the pawns. I guess it's a draw. I see that happen all the time. You want to slowly push your pawns. Eventually, you will have to make commitments, right? You'll have to commit to pushing a pawn. Do it slowly. Get your pieces in. If you're curious if they'll allow some complicated line, let them do it. And put them in positions where they have to make decisions. So the clock also tends to be a very big factor, because it's an endgame. Very likely, you don't have tons of time. So in this position, Firoujza has 4 minutes to Magnus's a little over 10, to give you an idea. So For Firouzja, like 4 minutes is an eternity. For most players, that's not a lot of time. And one of the things is that if your opponent does have time, you want to give them as many decisions as you can so they use their time. If you just walk around, like, move your king around for several moves and don't achieve anything, but your opponent had to burn 5-10 minutes, that's great. So that's a big part of it. Now, if you're playing the defense, one thing you want to know is, okay, if you know you're drawing, what is the main thing you cannot allow? What are the main things you have to do to remain in the draw zone? And what setup do you want to do? And then the major question is always, is this a critical position? If it is a critical position, that means you have to find one move or one of 2 or 3 moves that are only drawing moves. Most positions will not be critical, and therefore you should make sure you play quickly. If you're trying to defend and you're taking a minute a move, you're just going to run out of time, and when you get low on time, that's when it's more dangerous. So you want to make sure you're playing quickly. If you're playing the offense and you don't have tons of time, you also want to make sure, of course, if you get really low on time, it could be harder for you as well, but it's less important than the defender making sure they do not get low on time. So playing quickly is extremely important, but carefully. If it's a critical decision, that's when you do spend your time and make sure. And from the offense point of view, that also means that one of the things you want to do is make it, and this is something Magnus did this game and has done masterfully, when they have to make critical decisions, make sure that is when they are low on time. That's when they've been defending for 30 moves. Then they have to make a critical decision. But let me show you how it goes. I can talk forever, which I don't think anyone's going to be happy about. So just to show you a few of my thoughts on just a few of the positions. When I first saw this position, I'm like, okay, obviously it's a draw. Firouzja chose rook c7. Again, many moves draw. There's no run right away. One thing I find is that if I have an active rook, I always see if I can just keep it. And I don't see anything wrong with just playing a move like this and saying, okay, if you want to play h5 check, that's fine. If you want to put your rook on f5, it's an awkward square. I don't mind going back. And basically challenging white to show how they're going to actually advance. If they play rook f4, probably I can just go back, right? I can then move my king here. I'm hitting this pawn. I'm not going to play king h6 and hang my pawn, obviously. This is another thing. Trading pawns, of course, is very good. But you don't want to trade these pawns, right? You don't want G and F against H. That's going to be more double-edged because white has a passed pawn. Should still be drawn, of course. But you'd like to keep it further in the draw zone, and that means not giving your opponent a passed pawn or making the pawn structure imbalanced in some way for no reason. But I don't see a reason why he wouldn't do that. But he thought rook c7 was simpler, fair enough. King g4. So king here. And Magnus thought a while on this move. He thought over a minute of his 9 minutes left on this move, which tells you something. When you have a position where you're pushing a pawn, these are the decisions you want to take your time. Whether you're playing the offense or the defense. Every time you push a pawn, that is a move you cannot take back. So every pawn move is significant. And my guess would be that Magnus thought that he could not win without playing h5, meaning that if he allows black to play h5, the defense is going to be too simple because he's going to have to just trade pawns too much. Incidentally, even if he achieves h5, like let's say black puts a pawn on h5, let's just say he plays this and white plays here. Of course, this should not be played in this way, but just to show you, like this kind of exchange is not necessarily all that wonderful, especially if the king gets checked back. And of course, here you can just check endlessly. This is a bad example. But this kind of thing, because the king still has shelter, it's a lot better than having the pawns the other way, where the black king is out in the open and can experience more problems. So just something to note. So Magnus does choose to play h5, king f7. And this is the next important step. Firouzja realizes he's going to have to surrender the f5 square, which he does. But his point is that he can simply maintain his rook here, and if the rook ever moves, he can check. So this is a big part of knowing what to do and what you can allow and what you cannot allow in these positions. Make sure you see how your opponent can make progress and make sure you have a way to hinder that. The king getting into f5 looks like progress, and it surely is. But is it enough to do anything? Firouzja thinks not, because he's going to move his pieces back and forth. Here, though, he makes an interesting decision. So Firouzja plays the move h6, and he has 3 minutes here. He spends 50 seconds, which is actually significant. Most moves you should play very quickly, but notice how it's a pawn move and he's taking his time. These are things you should emulate. If you're going to push a pawn, be extra careful. I think a lot of the big mistakes people make are they push a pawn when they absolutely should not. And they usually do it very quickly. But you'll notice that when grandmasters or other strong players play these kind of endgames, they're very reticent about pushing pawns because once you do it, it's a committal decision. You can't go back. Here, I don't necessarily think the h6 pawn push is bad. Once again, we're in a territory where there are many drawing moves. And most likely he knows this. So he's not going to get too stressed out. He doesn't want to use all his 3 minutes here. But I don't know. Personally, I liked leaving the pawn on h7. I feel like white can put a pawn on h6. But I'm not particularly worried about this because now if the king ever moves, I have this to target this pawn. So for example, rook c7, f4, rook b7. So if white tries to just shove, just for example, and so you know, like if he tries to do something like this, you're still doing nothing. If you ever move the king here, and this is a weak pawn. So let's say g4, rook c7, rook here, you can check. And here you have to be a bit careful. If you play king g6, you're allowing g5, which again, maybe you still have a magical way to draw a position like this, but you don't even want to calculate it. That's not something you want to do. But you can continue checking. Notice how it's very important that you didn't go to d7. This might be playable, but the problem now is your rook cannot check my king again. So keeping appropriate checking distance with the rook is a very, very good technique in general. So rook check, rook c3 check, and there's just no way to make progress. If you try to come this way, I take your pawn. You can try to do something like this. But there's always going to be some way. I think that the cleanest way would be something like this and targeting this pawn from behind. And I don't think white is going to have too many chances to try to win the game. You still have to be relatively cautious, of course. For example, if king e4, you have to make sure that the king here is not going to be a problem. In this case, I think we can retreat our rook. And the big thing we have going for us is that if they try to do this, you actually have to be careful. Yeah, so even here, right? So just to give you an example of how tricky these things can be, if king takes f6, we have rook g6 check taking the pawn. That should be fairly simple, but white has this move, threatening mates, which means that we have to defend against mate. We have to check, and we have to allow this. And now it's like we can play rook e8. We're probably still drawing, but is this actually what we want to be doing? So, you know, it's one of those things where even here, you have to be very, very cautious with how you play. But I do think that he didn't really want to allow the pawn to h6. Fair enough. I don't think it matters too much. It really doesn't. But note how every pawn push you have to be very careful. So here Magnus tries something which I quite like. He does this. And his idea is that after Firoujza goes back, because now the problem is you cannot allow check. Like if you allow check and that, it's bad. So it means after rook a7 check, you have to go to the king on the back rank. The king on the back rank in general is not wonderful news. It's not necessarily fatal, but it is something he wants to avoid for now. And here Magnus plays here. So this is what's very clever. Notice how Firoujza at this point has 2 minutes left, and Magnus is perhaps threatening this. So he's creating additional threat. Is this threat going to murder black? Of course not. But the whole point is that it makes him think. And this is where he has to take time. Firoujza played rook b7, but he spent 40 seconds. He's spending a good percentage of his time. He's probably calculating, do I have to play rook here? But then there's check, and then I don't like allowing the king in, right? So he chooses instead to do this. And the whole point is after rook g4, he plays here. And this has to be well calculated. King h4, rook here. And his point is that after rook g6, he can check, and very importantly, play the move f5 check. So the idea is that if king takes f5, rook takes pawn, you actually lose. So you have to play here and then takes, and this should be a fairly effortless draw. Even this, I would say, is like, you have to be a little careful because the rook is like very strangely placed. But the main thing is that you can just kind of sit here, I think, because this pawn's always hanging. So I think that's going to be a relatively simple draw. But he had to calculate this. He had to be absolutely sure, and this is what happened. Rook a4, he goes back, and Magnus just goes back. So you think, well, what did he achieve with all that? Why did he play king h3? He played it because it was something black had to defend against, and he had to use up half of his remaining time. Magnus used some time too, but notice how playing the offense tends to be much simpler. And therefore, having time, like if both sides, if you ask the offense, would you like both of you to be under a minute, or would you like both of you to be under, like, have 10 minutes or more? The offensive side, unless black is some, whiz and white is the slowest person imaginable, you'd still want to have less time for both players if you're the offense, because the defense requires more precision generally than the offense. So it's just an important thing to remember. So playing quickly or as black, and then making sure that you give your opponent stuff to think about is very important. So Magnus goes for a different idea now. So rook c7, king e4. So Magnus basically is saying, okay, I can't win with the king on f5, so I'm going to try to reroute it. So check, king f3. So his idea for Firoujza is that if this, I think, a move like rook e3, he can cut off the king, or even check first and cut off the king. You'll see something like this happen later. So basically Firoujza decides to sit. Magnus does this, so he's basically hinting that this is a possibility, right? So Firoujza decides not to care, and Magnus does not go for it. You'll notice that this was a big bluff. I'm guessing that in general this is just not going to work. I have so many checks, this pawn is weak. If I have to play f5, it's not even necessarily the end of the world. So like even f5 here followed by check, like I don't think white's going to win this. So, but it's kind of like a nice bluff, right? Like why not? And this is the other thing. You can play moves like that and not go for your idea. Notice how he's delaying the critical move, the critical moments. He's not just directly playing there. And I have to say, for a player like myself, this was a really hard thing to understand. It took me a while because I was always a player who was kind of, okay, I'm going to play what I think is directly the best line and go for that and figure out the best thing. And all right, I'm going to play directly into this. And at some point, I had to learn some of these nuances to try to, do the best I could in these positions to try to, because I had so many games where it's like some drawish endgame, maybe a low-rated player in an open. I want to make sure I can fight for first place. You got to win some of these games, and at this level, it's very rare. Defense is so strong, but even at this level, this is how you do it, and this is how you should try to win, regardless of what level you're at, which is basically you do wear your opponent down. There's an element of trying to wear your opponent down, and it's like, I don't know what you want to compare it to. You could compare it to boxing, right? The punch that will get your opponent, like in round 11, is different than the one in round 2. Round 2, that punch may not be so great. In round 11, I apologize to anyone who knows about boxing and will tell me that's wrong, but I think you get the idea. So, they're dancing around. Nothing too much is happening, right? Like, we have a similar position. Firoujza's holding steady. He's keeping his time above a minute. Magnus is actually under at this point, but like I said, it doesn't matter so much. And Magnus goes for it and decides to play f5. f5, of course, is an extreme commitment. You're closing off that avenue for the king. But Magnus's idea is that currently, if he tries to chase after stuff, the black rook will just have a field day with these pawns. So his idea is that he wants to make sure white's like really battened down, and his idea is to sacrifice this pawn in some way, bring the king up and try to go this way. And you'll see him try to accomplish this. So it happens this way. King d4. You have to be a little careful. Blundering something like this can really ruin your day. So whether you're playing the offense or the defense, you have to be cautious. So he plays like this. Rook b7. This is kind of where I'm start to depart from what Firoujza does, in that I don't think I would want to give up this king cutoff. I care about that more than the rook on the 7th, because I think the rook on the 7th is going to happen anyway, because white can threaten a rook trade. I'm going to have to move the rook. So because I'm going to have to surrender that anyway, I think the move I wanted was just rook d3, for example. Attacking the pawn. Probably we get checked, we go back, okay. And now we just sit and say, what are you doing? If the king cannot go here, white is not doing anything, right? This is very important. So white can try something like this to try to play rook d6, for example, but I play like this. And I can just give checks. The idea is that if the king goes here, I can play check. I could also go here, but then I'm allowing something like this. So I'm going to just try to delay that for the moment. Just keep giving checks. If the king tries to go here, now I'll attack this pawn. And, white can try to be tricky with something like this. But the fact is that they're not really threatening much. And even if I just check here, I just won this pawn. It's not a problem. So I think that this kind of thing is going to be a little bit easier to draw. I'm sure there are other attempts that white can make. I give a line with something like rook a4, trying to play rook d4. It's very important to note that this is always losing, because white has this opposition. If if you go here, 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 here. And if you haven't seen this pattern, this is one you should know. Even without the g-pawn, this is dead lost. You take this pawn. So you want to know your king and pawn endgames, which we'll actually get to. But something, you know, you can just move away was one option. I think I also like rook c1 check, because then the king actually has to block. And then you go here, and now there's no rook behind, so you're just going to check from the side. If the rook goes here, you check from here. Notice how there's always a way to force the king away and to make life difficult for white. So I would much prefer doing this. What he does is still a draw, right? Like, what he does is not necessarily bad, but now the white king is closer. Rather than being cut off here, you're cut off a move closer, and that means that taking this pawn is always going to be a bit more nerve-wracking. So Magnus could go for a direct line. And this is definitely an attempt. The problem is that, so the nice thing about this move is that you are trying to do stuff, so it forces white's hand a little bit. So after takes here, the idea, and it's very important to note, you're not going to do this, most likely. 1 second. Yeah, rook takes here. Well, if you do this, this would be an embarrassing way to lose as black. So after rook takes h6, I think that hold on, is this the position you have a... you just play king f7, I think. Then check and back? I don't know. King g8 maybe. So the problem is the rook kind of has to get forced away, and then you can go after a pawn and draw this way. It's a draw, I think, but it's like... This is the kind of draw where you're like really like, you know, a little bit nervous, but yes, this should be a very simple draw, I believe. I look forward to seeing the comments. Anyway, I didn't actually prepare that particular line, because king e6 looks like the more natural way to do it, because you keep the king cut off, you're ready to, you can still take this pawn next move anyways. But the problem is now black can check from the side, and the check from the side forces the king away. You can do this. Even if white achieves this, the problem is that black has infinite checks, and once the king gets really far away, you're never going to be able to win. Also note how you can attack this pawn. If pawn push, you can attack it from behind, and it's just going to get lost. So there's no real way to try to win this. So what Magnus does is he plays here and just plays a waiting move, and in some ways this is clever, because it's not necessarily winning, right? It's not winning, but it forces Firoujza to make another choice. So he could choose to take the pawn, which is what he does, or he can play this and allow this, right? Now, this is actually probably would have been my choice, simply because I want to be able to play this, and the idea is that now if king here, you have a check, right? And the king can't get in. So I like the idea of keeping the king cut off and just kind of remaining here. And then once this happens, you can go here. And this is a fairly nice way to draw. I think that's a bit easier, because what he does is he takes this pawn, and now he has to be quite precise. So here, maybe he was banking on the fact that Magnus would capture, and then he has all these unlimited checks. So once again, if the white king has to venture too far, you're just not going to win. You'll just start attacking pawns. But here, Magnus plays a very, very nice move, which is this. And maybe Firoujza missed this. He has 30 seconds. Believe me, anyone can miss things with 30 seconds. And the idea now is that if check, you can block, and then you can take this pawn next move, which is quite annoying. So rook a1, and now he takes. And the big difference is that here, after check, you can block with a rook, which is exactly what he does. And it was quite clear that Firoujza had, I would say, like, there's no way he wasn't aware of this. I think that he had, again, I think he was tired, right? He was defending... You know, something happened. He had a bit of a mind meltdown. I mean, these kind of things happen. It's not something I would judge a player for, because it's happened to everyone. Like, it's just something that can happen to any player. I've seen Magnus himself lose, like, a very theoretically drawn rook endgame to a little bit tricky, but it was like, you know, he lost it to Aronian. I still remember when he was younger, and it's something that can happen no matter how strong you are. But the way you can set this up if you're white is by making sure you do wear your opponent down. You force them to make these decisions after defending for 30, 40 moves. And if you can imagine, if someone as strong as Firoujza can mess up here, what is, you know, a 1500 player going to do? What is a 2000 player or even 2300 going to do, right? So really making sure you put your opponent through the ringer is extremely important. Because here it was quite clear that Firouzja was banking on something that is not going to work. But already I'd say the draw is very, very tricky with low time unless you know these endgames like the back of your hand. Having, really great endgame knowledge is definitely critical. I would say that if you don't know anything about these endgames, your odds of drawing are pretty low. If you know something, your odds are at least better. So Firouzja played rook b6, rook d6. And now it's still a draw. Black can play the rook down. Or rook b2, I think is the line I gave. King f6. It doesn't really matter where the rook goes, as long as it goes down so it's able to check. So here you're threatening this. You cannot play passively. If you try to play a passive defense, something like this, I put the pawn here, my rook maneuvers to h7, you're basically done. That's not going to work out. I don't even need this pawn. So you have to make sure you move your king. And the basic idea is that if something like king g6, so you can play rook check, is also a line, and go here. This is also testing. But the key here is that it's not so easy because this king is out of the way. So this rook is always threatening to check from the side. Is a very important detail. But white can go for this pawn right away. But the main drawback is that even though you win the two pawns, as we know, f and h are often drawn. Black has to be careful. If the king gets cut off, you get something like that, it's often a win. But this king on h6 is actually quite bad. So you do something like this, and it's very difficult for white to move or make progress. Because if black's able to win this pawn comfortably, you're not going to have success winning with the h pawn. And that's kind of the problem. So I also thought this line was fairly testing with here. And then rook here. So here you actually have the king cut off. And this is what's really hard. To know that this is a draw is not so simple. But the key is that you're still able to check indefinitely from behind. And that's sort of the problem, right? The king just does not have shelter at all. So I think the best try would be the king marching. But here you can actually, here you can actually, this is where you have to make sure you're careful. You can actually just trade rooks. Here, and the king can try in vain, but you're able to catch it. So you're able to trade rooks, and this is a really important factor here. So even with the pawn on f6, even with this, you're not able to win. But this is hard to see. This is where you wanted to try to play the defense a bit better earlier, I would say. Already it's very difficult. So this is something that's very important when you're defending these endgames. You will lose because of a blunder, but you can definitely plan your defense as far as how you want to cut the king off, what you want to allow, what you don't want to allow. Some things you have to allow, other things you don't. And even though he's still in the draw zone, he definitely allowed things that he did not have to allow. Again, 30 seconds left. Good luck to almost anyone trying to hold against Magnus or even other players, right? And but I would say that it already had become difficult, right? It's already to the point where he has to do that. But I would say that you want to be careful. So he plays rook takes d6 in this position. Maybe he got confused with the pawns were. I'm not exactly sure. There's no way that a GM of his strength didn't know that this was lost. So maybe you already thought he was lost, but that still seems odd. You would still move the rook. And that's the thing. If you know that this is losing, right, you move the rook. You just move the rook anywhere. Anywhere else. Rook here, rook here. Because with the rook endgame, you might not lose. Even if you're unsure, it's tricky, it's h and f, you just move. So there can be a practical aspect when you don't have time to calculate it thoroughly. But for those of you who are not sure, how do you win this endgame? So this is a good test for yourself if you want to pause and see. But yeah, this is a main thing of king triangulation. So the key is the king goes here. If the black king goes here and you go here, the king simply penetrates and takes the pawn. So king f8 is played, and this is a position I've gone over with lots of students. It can happen in any game. And the key is that with this position, with white to move, you can't really make progress. You can do this, but black is just fine. So you need this position to be with black to move. And because black does not have so many squares, black can't really make a triangle here. They are not able to stay with you. So the key is to triangulate your king. It's called king triangulation. And the purpose of king triangulation is to lose a tempo. A lot of people know the idea of king triangulation, but they don't necessarily know why they're doing it. So make sure you know the idea is to lose a tempo. You do this. The king can never go here. I call these mind squares, right? Because if the white king goes here, you go here. And this is forced. So you cannot go to the mind squares, so black has to move somewhere. You play king here. And again, black's stuck. They can't go here because of this. If they go here, you just walk in, no problem. So they have to go here. And that's kind of all she wrote. So after king f7, for example, you go here once again. And if king here, the difference is because you've lost the tempo, it is now black to move in this position. And it's no problem. Just make sure you don't queen here. Also, I get so many students who want to rook the pawn. Just go here, you know, like win like a normal human being. You do not have to rook the pawn or be fancy. But anyhow, I hope that you found this useful. These kind of endgames occur all the time. They really do. It's not always 3 versus 2. It could be 4 versus 3 is often a draw. You have to do it. I've had to hold 4 versus 3 at least a couple times. And I'm sure 3 versus 2, you probably had the offense. You could get the defense. It could be a different type of endgame, maybe not a rook endgame. The key is to figure out, number one, realize it's a draw. Like, know that with best play it should be drawn. If you're playing the offense, don't be in a hurry. Slowly build your position. Slowly push your pawns. The idea is to wear your opponent out a little bit, to wear out their clock in particular, but as well as people get tired. Make the critical positions later and later as you can, and force your opponent to make as many decisions as possible. You know, if you force them to make 8 decisions, they're gonna be just more likely to make a mistake than if you only make them have one critical decision at some point and they have time to make it, right? So give as many decisions as you can for both sides. Be very careful of pawn pushes. Those are the moves you want to think a little bit to make sure you're not putting a pawn on a weak square or giving up your winning chance or something like this. And as the defense, like really make sure that you're playing quickly when you can, realizing the critical positions, but having a plan for what setup you want, what you want to allow from your opponent, what you don't want to allow. Like where you want to cut off your opponent's king, where your rook can remain active, when it has to become passive. In general, active is better than passive, but there are times passive defense is perfectly sufficient and is just should do the trick. And you know, it takes a lot of practice, but the better you get at these, the more it will help you milk those extra half points from your tournament games. Anyway, I hope you found this useful, and stay tuned for more.